Excuse me, Mr. Kamal. Mr. Kamal.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalatu wassalamu ala asrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. Asyhadu an la ilaha illallah wa asyhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh la nabiyya ba'dah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We go back again to our international conference on social and Islamic studies for the second day. And today we are going to hear the presentation and explanation from the two main speakers. They are the Excellency Associate Professor Mr. Kamaluddin Nurdin Marjuni. He is one of the senior lecturer in Department of Aqidah and Religion Studies, University Science Islam Malaysia. And then the second main speakers for today is Mr. Anakeri, Dr. Anakeri, She is one of the senior lecturer in Faculty of Education, Monash University, Australia. And today, she will be assisted by Dr. Nera Lemon. She is an associate professor in education and the associate dean in education as well in the School of Social Sciences, Media, Film and Education at Swinburne University of Technology, Melbourne, Australia. All right, to utilize the time, I'd like briefly to read the curriculum vitae of the first main speakers today, Associate Professor Dr. Kamaluddin Nurdin Marjuni. He has gained his PhD in Islamic philosophy in 2005 in Faculty of Darul Uloom, Cairo University, Egypt. And he gained his master in theology in 2002, at the same faculty. It is Faculty of Darul Uloom, Cairo University, Egypt. And his bachelor degree in Islamic law in 1997, in Faculty of Law, Al-Azhar University, Branch Tanta, Egypt. And he has just finished his visiting professor in France, especially in Academy European des Cultures at the Savoir Islamicus from 5 January 20 until today. And he has just go back to Malaysia, and he has many tasks in administration, and I couldn't mention one by one. All right. Dr. Kamaluddin will present his paper under the title The Urgence of Maqasid in Aqidah Maqasid in Islamic Theology, or in Malay language, or in Bahasa. The title is Urgensi Kajian Maqasid akidah dalam teologi Islam. Ya, as I know, maqasid means the goal or the target of the Muslim in undergoing their lives. All right, so I'm inviting Associate Professor Kamaluddin Nurdin Marjuni to elaborate, to explain his paper in around 8 until 10 minutes. So, sorry. Oh, yeah, I add more times, so until 30 minutes, Mr. Kamal. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, Doctor. Thank you very much.
Okay, as the information, so after Mr. Kamal explaining his paper, so it will be for the Q&A, question and answer session, and after that, in the next 20 minutes, Dr. Anne and Narel will join the conference by Zoom. All right, we go back to Mr. Kamal. The time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, my brother, Dr. Nasro, for this time, and thank you for invitation. Okay, I would share my PPT. How disabled participant screen sharing. I cannot share my PPT.
Yeah, all right. Already, sir, please.
Okay. You can see the PPT.
Yes, sir. Everyone could see your slides.
Okay.
You might begin your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Alhamdulillah, terima kasih kepada saudara moderator Dr. Nasro. Thank you very much for you for this time, dan kepada rekan-rekan semua, ada akademis di UIN Makassar dan berbagai UIN dan universiti di Indonesia. Jadi saya siapkan slide ini dalam bahasa Melayu, jadi kiranya boleh dipahami secara mendalam, dan insyaAllah tajuk yang saya akan bentangkan pada pagi ini adalah berjudul tentang potensi kajian maqasid akidah dalam teologi Islam. Okey. Sebenarnya pasal ini adalah pasal kajian akidah yang sangat diperlukan dalam memberikan satu sumbangan untuk perkembangan kajian teologi Islam. Jadi kena waktu yang begitu singkat, jadi saya mungkin hanya menyentuh beberapa aspek saja dari 5 aspek yang sedia ada, yaitu pengenalan maqasid akidah, maqasid akidah dan teologi Islam, usul dan furu' akidah, konsep maqasid akidah, pembagian maqasid akidah. Pengenalan, jadi secara bahasa kita sudah tentu tahu sama-sama, terutama yang dalam bidang Islami tadi. Jadi maksud ini merupakan kata kerja dari qasada yang bermaksud tujuan, sasaran, rahasia. Dan perkataan maksud pun juga atau al-qasdu khususnya itu pun disebut dalam Al-Quran, dan itu pun juga menandakan bahwasanya maksud itu adalah satu jalan, ya. Seperti kalau kita buka beberapa tafsir Al-Qurtubi contohnya, begitu juga At-Tabari. Jadi ketika menafsirkan sebuah ayat, wa 'alallahi qasdus sabil wa minha jairun walau sya'al hadakum ajma'in. Jadi para penafsir ini akan mengatakan bahwasanya al-qasdu ini adalah merupakan jalan yang lurus atau jalan yang benar. Dan secara terminologi, jadi sampai saat ini pun juga belum ada takrif yang paten dibuat oleh ulama-ulama. Disebabkan kerana memang kajian maqasid ini hampir boleh dikatakan sangat-sangat sedikit. Ya, jadi sangat sedikit sebab kita selalunya tahu bahwasanya ketika kita mengatakan maqasid itu selalu berhubungan dengan maqasid asy-syariah. Oleh karena itu, saya sebagai salah seorang yang dalam 2 tahun ini memberikan fokus perhatian kepada kajian maqasid dalam akidah, berusaha pun juga untuk memberikan satu takrifan bahwasanya maqasid ini adalah merupakan pedoman seorang muslim dalam memaknai dan mengidentifasi hakikat akidah tauhid yang di dalamnya terdapat hikmah, rahasia, tujuan, target, gaya bertauhid melalui konsep iman yang 3, yaitu at-tasdiqu bil qalbi, al-iqrar bil lisan, wa al-amalu bil jawarih. Semua takrifan ini dan persoalan ini saya menulis dalam kitab saya yang terbit tahun 2014. Itu di samping kanan ada yang berjudul Al-Aqidah Al-Islamiyah wal Qadaya Al-Khilafiyah 'inda Ulama'il Kalam. Jadi ini buku saya tulis atau terbit tahun 2014 dan dicetak di Darul Kutub Ilmiah Beirut. Jadi alhamdulillah buku ini sudah dipasarkan sudah sekitar 7 tahunan. Hingga sekarang sudah 100-an ribu cetakan telah disebarkan di beberapa negara. Oke, tentang maqasid. Maaf, ini dia terjalan sendiri. Ya, jadi mungkin pertanyaan sekarang, apakah betul ada kajian maqasid dalam Islamic study? Itu satu persoalan besar yang dihadapi oleh para teolog atau para pengkaji ilmu kalam. Jadi kalau kita melihat ucapan seorang ulama kontemporer dalam bidang maqasid yang sudah begitu dikenal, masyhur, yaitu Bapak Profesor Ahmad Resuni. Dalam simposium Maqasid tahun 2005 yang diselenggarakan oleh Yayasan Islam Al-Furqan di London, Inggris, nampaknya memang beliau sangat memberikan satu perhatian yang besar kepada akidah. Dalam artian beliau menilai ada beberapa kekosongan di ruang yang belum lagi dibahas oleh para pengkaji-pengkaji akidah atau teologi Islam. Sehinggalah beliau merasa perlu ada kajian maqasid akidah oleh tokoh-tokoh atau ulama-ulama akidah Islam di seluruh dunia. Sehingga beliau sendiri sebenarnya sudah berusaha untuk mengkaji maqasid akidah. Namun dikarenakan memang beliau pun mengaku sendiri, ya, dalam ucapannya bahwasanya bidang saya karena bukan dalam akidah, maka tentunya saya punya keterbatasan untuk mengkajinya secara komprehensif. Oleh karena itu, kata beliau, cukuplah saya hanya mengingatkan saja kepada para ulama-ulama akidah untuk menceburi bidang maqasid akidah atau menulis setidak-tidaknya memulakan paper Oke, Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Baik, mohon maaf yang sangat-sangat tadi atas internet yang tidak baik di kantor. Jadi sekarang ini saya berada di rumah. Oke, jadi terus saya lanjutkan bahwasanya tadi maqasid akidah memang dipertanyakan, adakah betul ada maqasid akidah atau adakah kajian? Nah, jadi jawabannya ternyata boleh dikata kajian maqasid akidah ini memang sangat-sangat minim. Bahkan apa namanya ini, ulama maqasid kontemporer sendiri mempertanyakan hal demikian, dan beliau pun juga mengharap supaya para pengkaji akidah untuk memberikan satu sumbangsi kepada kajian maqasid akidah. Selanjutnya, jadi kalau kita melihat sebenarnya sejarah maqasid sudah ada dari zaman klasik atau zaman turas. Jadi tentunya ini sudah ditandai dengan kajian Imam Ghazali sendiri. Dan kalau kita membaca turas-turas atau kitab-kitab Imam Ghazali, beliau mengungkapkan bahwasanya maqasid akidah ini di dalam kitabnya itu selalu diberikan satu istilah al-asrar wa al-ma'ani. Bahkan beliau katakan dalam kitab Al-Maqsad Al-Asna. Nah, jadi kalau kita melihat kitab ini sendiri berjudul tentang Al-Maqsad Al-Asna. Jadi maqasid dalam asma dan sifat Allah. Apa kata beliau? Perkara maqasid akidah merupakan persoalan yang sangat berharga di dalam hati, permasalahannya sukar dipahami, dan persoalannya begitu rumit, sangat tinggi nilai dan tujuannya, serta mencabar ketajaman pikiran akal tanpa bandingannya, bahkan hingga di penghujung kajian. Jadi kalau kita melihat sendiri, tentu memang bibit-bibit maqasid itu sudah ditanamkan oleh beliau, yaitu Imam Ghazali. Dan kemudian juga ada ulama lain daripada ulama teolog Islam, daripada akidah al-Asy'ariyah, yaitu Imam Sa'ad bin At-Taftazani. Beliau pun sebenarnya ada kitab yang berjudul Syarhul Maqasid. Syarhul Maqasid maknanya penjelasan tentang maqasid dalam ilmu kalam. Next. Oke. Jadi sekarang pertanyaannya, kenapa kajian maqasid ini tidak begitu berkembang hingga saat ini? Sebab tadi kalau kita melihat Dr. Resuli sendiri mempertanyakan semenjak 15 tahun lalu, yaitu tahun 2005, supaya pengkaji akidah ini menggeluti bidang maqasid atau menulis setidaknya buku tentang maqasid atau artikel. Ternyata hingga saat ini belum lagi kita temukan kajian-kajian yang komprehensif dan sistematik. Jadi sekarang dipertanyakan kenapa hingga demikian. Jadi saya menemukan dalam tulisan ini bahwasanya secara tidak langsung ucapan Imam Ghazali itu menunjukkan bahwasanya salah satu penyebab kenapa kajian maqasid ini agak lamban. Sebab apa? Karena implementasinya itu bukan satu hal yang mudah. Karena memerlukan ekstra kekuatan akal pikiran dalam merefleksikan persoalan-persoalan akidah secara komprehensif, integral dan holistik, dengan merenungkan apa jua persoalan akidah yang semuanya berkait erat dengan hubungan Allah dengan hambanya. Dan saya temukan juga bahwasanya di antara penyebab kajian maqasid ini tidak berkembang dalam teologi Islam, yaitu karena kita melihat jadi tabiat ilmu akidah itu sendiri yang sifatnya absolut dan pasti. Dalam artian tidak akan mengalami perubahan. Jadi tentang akidah ini tidak berkembang. Jadi dari dulu lagi kita memiliki rukun iman yang 6. Tidak ada tambahan, tidak ada pengurangan. Jadi ini saya rasa merupakan satu hal yang menyebabkan kajian maqasid ini agak mundur ke belakang sehingga tidak berkembang sebagaimana apa yang kita lihat di maqasid syariah. Dan ada lagi satu hal, jadi karena di samping itu beberapa faktor lain seperti juga karena kajian teologi lebih fokus kepada persoalan-persoalan klasik khilafiyah akidah. Jadi ini juga yang membuat kenapa ilmu kalam ini begitu kering ya, statis. Jadi disebabkan karena memang persoalan-persoalan yang dikaji dari dulu sampai sekarang ini masih saja beredar, berputar-putar di dalam kajian-kajian yang kontroversial. Ya, apa dia? Ya seperti masih lagi dipersoalkan tentang yadullahi fawqa aydihim. Jadi kalau dalam Quran yadullahi fawqa aydihim itu apa maksudnya? Apakah diterjemah, ditafsirkan, ditakwil, atau dikekalkan maknanya? Jadi sehingga dengan adanya kontroversi yang selalu diungkit dan dibangkitkan di masyarakat bahkan dalam keadaan akademik melulu itu saja. Jadi inilah salah satu penyebab kerana mereka tidak begitu memperhatikan kajian maqasid akidah. Okey. Next. Sekarang dalam pengkajian maqasid ini kita perlu memikirkan juga aspek-aspek lain. Jadi untuk mencapai target bagaimana kita ini boleh mengkaji maqasid akidah, jadi kita perlu memberikan perhatian tentang adanya pembahagian usul dan furu' dalam akidah. Jadi usul akidah ini adalah prinsip, asas tonggak agama, sumbernya qat'i subut dan dalilnya pun bersifat qat'i dilalah. Jadi qat'i dilalah ini maksudnya lafaznya tidak mengandung kebolehjadian perbezaan pendapat sebab maknanya tunggal sehingga tidak mungkin dipahami dari makna lain selain yang ditujukan lafaz itu sendiri. Jadi qat'i subut dan qat'i ad-dilalah. Ini maknanya perkara usul akidah. Usul akidah ini tentu kita sudah tahu semua bagaimana tauhidullah, malaikat, rasul, nabi, jin, baginda Muhammad dan nabi terakhir, iman kepada Allah, turunkan Taurat, kitab-kitab Taurat, Injil dan Quran, dan fatwa-fatwa Al-Quran, kemaksuman nabi, mujizat hari kiamat, qada dan qadar, dan ada lainnya lagi. Jadi ini adalah usul akidah. Jadi maknanya perkara-perkara ini kita tidak boleh ada ijtihad. Kita tidak boleh berpikir, tidak boleh meragukan sedikit pun tentang kebenaran-kebenaran hal-hal yang saya sebutkan tadi. Sebab apa? Sumbernya adalah qat'i subut dan dalilnya pun juga qat'i subut. Jadi tentang wujudnya Allah sudah jelas, ya. Itu salah satu password bagaimana seorang boleh masuk Islam. Jadi qul huwallahu ahad, Allahus samad dan sebagainya. Setelah itu kita melihat kembali ini slide-nya tak boleh jalan. Okey, perkara furu' akidah. Furu' akidah ini dalam artian sumbernya subut, namun bersifat zanni ad-dilalah. Dalam artian lafaznya itu mengandung kebolehjadian perbezaan pendapat sebab maknanya tidak tunggal sehingga mungkin difahami darinya makna lain selain yang diajukan atau ditunjukkan lafaz itu. Jadi qat'i subut dan zanni ad-dilalah. Contohnya dalam furu' akidah ini seperti perkara melihat Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Dalam Al-Qur'an dikatakan wujuhun yauma idzin nadhiratun ila rabbiha nazirah. Jadi tentunya ayat ini adalah qat'i subut, sumbernya ada. Jadi persoalan melihat Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Tetapi cara melihatnya itu menjadi pertikaian ulama. Jadi bagaimana cara kita ini melihat Allah di hari kiamat? Berarti adalah zanni dilalah. Kenapa? Karena tidak jelas bagaimana cara melihat Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Kita lihat next. Jadi ketidakpahaman tentang perkara usul dan furu' dapat mengakibatkan pertentangan pandangan yang ekstrim dalam menilai benar tidaknya persoalan akidah yang selalu diperdebatkan akan menjadi polemik yang mengarah kepada faham radikal, saling menghujat, menjatuhkan, dan parahnya sampai kepada titik pengkafiran. Dan hal ini selalu bermotifkan ta'assub kelompok yang dibangun atas keangkuhan. Jadi, tatkala kita tidak pandai memahami perkara akidah atau pembahagiannya kepada usul dan furu', ini akan mengakibatkan kita menjadi seakan-akan benar sendiri, yang lain salah. Jadi karena yang lain salah ini berarti kafir, berarti sesat dan sebagainya. Kenapa? Karena tidak tahu membedakan mana yang perkara furu' dalam akidah dan mana yang perkara asas dalam akidah. Contoh tadi, ketika kalau kita melihat kepada pandangan teologi, ru'yatullah. Jadi kalau teologi Mu'tazilah katakan ru'yatullah itu dengan hati, perasaan melihat Allah di hari kiamat. Sementara teolog Asy'ari Maturidi mengatakan tidak, memang dengan mata kepala, sekalipun kita tidak menjelaskan tahdid, limit bagaimana melihat Allah Subhanahu wa taala yang jelas dengan mata. Jadi sini ada perbezaan. Jadi ini adalah furu' perbezaannya. Yang asasnya tadi qat'u subut tentang melihat Allah, tapi cara melihat Allah itu dibezakan antara pemikiran Mu'tazilah dan pemikiran Asy'ariyah dan Maturidiyah. Jadi sekarang kalau kita ambil mana-mana satu, kita ambil umpama mazhab atau akidah Mu'tazilah, tidak ada masalah. Kita tidak boleh dihukum kafir atau sesat dan sebagainya. Sebab ini adalah furu' akidah. Tetapi kalau kita ingkar melihat Allah Subhanahu wa taala, itu berbahaya sebab itu adalah usulnya di situ. Jadi melihat Allah, tapi caranya itu adalah furu' akidah. Oke, kita teruskan. Jadi saya tidak ambil masa yang banyak, mungkin 10 menit saja. Konsep maqasid akidah. Jadi sebenarnya konsep maqasid akidah ini dalam kajian teologi ini memang kita akui belum sistematis, belum tersusun rapi sebagaimana hanya maqasid syariah. Sebab apa? Kita kalau melihat membaca kitab-kitab maqasid syariah yang terkandung dalam beberapa kitab seperti kitab Al-Burhan fi Usul Fiqh, Al-Mustasfa min Ilmi Usul, Imam Ghazali, Al-Mahsuf fi Ilmi Usul, dan Qawaidul Ahkam dan Al-Mawaqi, Al-Muwafaqat, itu semuanya di dalamnya itu sudah terdapat secara sistematis penyusunan tentang maqasid akidah. Tetapi lain hanya dengan maqasid akidah. Memang kita tahu bahwasanya Imam Ghazali adalah sebagai salah satu penanam bibit-bibit maqasid asy-syariah. Namun sangat disayangkan, beliau pun juga tidak begitu memberikan satu bibit-bibit persoalan-persoalan maqasid akidah secara komprehensif. Sehingga beliau hanya saja menyentuh dalam satu kitab yaitu Al-Maqsadul Al-Asna. Jadi beliau berbincang menggambarkan tentang maqasid akidah itu hanya dalam persoalan asmaullahi wa sifatihi. Tapi secara keseluruhan itu beliau tidak bincangkan. Tapi itu mungkin hikmahnya membagi kita peluang kepada generasi setelahnya yang memang ingin mendalam atau mengkaji dalam ilmu kalam atau teologi Islam. Next. Jadi kalau kita melihat rumusan Imam Ghazali yang ditulis dalam kitabnya Al-Maqsad Al-Asna fi Syarhi Asma'il Husna. Jadi itu bahasanya di bawah. Jadi saya kasih bahasa Melayunya terus. Ketahuilah bahwa siapa saja mempelajari Asmaullah berdasarkan hanya teks lafaz, mengharapkan tafsir dan gambarannya dari segi bahasa saja, dengannya ia yakin bahwa makna Asmaullah sudah terpenuhi dalam hati, maka ia belum lagi berhasil menjangkau maknanya. Sebab apa? Hanya melihat dari aspek teks bahasa atau lafaz. Sebab pemahaman yang berdasarkan dengan lafaz saja diibaratkan hanya sebatas pendengaran. Pemahaman seperti ini pun ada pada binatang. Begitu juga dengan hanya melihat status kedudukan bahasa. Cara ini hanya dapat mendatangkan pengetahuan umum tentang bahasa Arab. Model pemahaman ini ada pada tingkatan sastrawan bahasa. Bahkan orang Badui pun, Badui Arab, yang tidak berpendidikan tahu dengan sebatas bahasa saja dengan pendengaran. Begitu juga jika memahami asmaullah hanya sekedar melihat maknanya tanpa diiringi dengan pendalaman makna al-kasyaf, maka pemahaman sedemikian hanya mendapat atau dapat memberikan makna dan pengakuan semata. Model pemahaman ini terdapat pada orang awam bahkan anak kecil. Jadi kalau kita melihat kitab beliau ini, di sini sudah ditanamkan bibit-bibit maqasid akidah. Cuman masalahnya hanya sebatas dalam asma'ullahi wa sifatihi saja. Next. Sekarang bagaimana kita mau mengidentifikasi maqasid akidah? Atau dalam persoalan akidah ini kan luas. Nah sekarang bagaimana kita ingin mengurai unsur atau elemen maqasid akidah dalam teologi Islam? Tentunya kita tidak terlepas dari pembahasan-pembahasan yang dikaji dalam ilmu balaghah dan lainnya. Jadi ada namanya al-ilaqah baina al-lafzi wal ma'na. Aspek lafaz, teks asal, dan itu kalau kita bahasakan secara sederhana adalah yang tersurat. Jadi yang nyata dalam ayat itu. Dan bisa ditemukan dalam kamus bahasa Arab. Jadi mudah sekali kalau kita hanya sekedar melihat aspek lafaz, yaitu teks asal daripada apa yang tertera dalam Al-Quran ataupun Sunnah. Jadi kita tinggal membuka saja kamus bahasa Arab, maka akan terlihat kepada kita apa arti lafaz tersebut. Tapi dalam mengarungi maqasid akidah, kita tidak sama sekali mungkin hanya sebatas dengan lafaz tersebut. Kenapa? Kita harus melangkah kepada aspek makna atau makna lafaz. Inilah dalam bahasa kita dalam sederhana yaitu tersirat. Caranya ini tentu ada ta'ammul. Kita merenung arti di sebalik teks asal tersebut. Lepas tu ada lagi aspek lain, iaitu kita melihat usul khitab. Jadi bagaimana pemaparan ayat itu. Dan pemaparan ayat itu kan ada berbagai-bagai. Ya, tentunya ini adalah bidang yang dapat dilihat dari segi tafsir atau ulumul Quran. Jadi kita melihat ada namanya aspek hal hakikah, aktual, makna hakikat, dan ada lagi aspek al-majazi atau metafor. Jadi pendalaman seperti ini, seorang pengkaji akidah perlu juga mempunyai background bahasa yang kuat. Jadi bukan hanya takwil begitu saja, tetapi perlukan juga hal-hal yang berkaitan dengan kebahasaan atau balaghah. Jadi sila rujuk kitab-kitab seperti Dalail al-I'jaz dan Al-Bayan at-Tabyin. Okay, next. Imam Ghazali pun juga memberikan bibit-bibit bagaimana menyelesaikan atau bagaimana mencapai tahap maqasid akidah. Jadi beliau kata dalam kitab yang bernama Mishkatul Anwar. Jadi ini metode aliran-aliran yang dipaparkan oleh Imam Al-Ghazali. Bahwasanya sebenarnya ulama-ulama kalam ini dalam membina pengetahuan mereka dan memahami, mendalami akidah itu ada beberapa kelompok. Yang pertama adalah Zahiri. Jadi Zahiri ini adalah eksoterik, tajriduz zawahir. Jadi istilah beliau dalam kitabnya Mishkatul Anwar, tajriduz zawahir. Dan ada lagi aspek batin, esoterik, tajridu al-bawatin. Dan ketiga, jadi bukan zahiri dan bukan batini, yaitu adalah integrasi antara zahiri dan batin. Dalam bahasa beliau, takriruz zawahiri wal gaus ala al-jawahir. Jadi maknanya, kita tidak boleh berpegang kepada zahir saja dan tak boleh berpegang kepada batin saja, tapi kita mesti integrasikan. Oleh karena itu, dalam kajian kontemporer, pemikiran Islam semasa ini, kita selalu mendengar ada integrasi nakli dan akli. Jadi inilah maksud tujuan daripada Imam Ghazali dalam kitab Mishkatul Anwar. Beliau katakan sambil menegaskan pilihannya kepada metodologi ketiga. Jadi beliau tinggalkan zawahir dan al-batin, tapi ambil yang ketiga. Oleh karena itu beliau kata, "Falladhi yujaridu zahira hasyawiyun, walladhi yujaridu al-batina batiniyun, walladhi yajma'u bainahuma kamilun." Jadi metodologi zahir adalah aliran Hasyawi dan metodologi batin adalah aliran Syiah Batiniyah, dan yang terbaik adalah memadukan kedua metodologi tersebut. Jadi kita cepat-cepat ngomongnya supaya waktu boleh terselesaikan semua. Next. Jadi tentunya setelah kita melihat unsur zahir, unsur batin, unsur lafaz, unsur makna, maka diperlukan alatnya yaitu takwil. Jadi disinilah tempat perselisihan yang selalu kita dengar antara Salafi dan Asy'ariyah Maturidi. Jadi kalau kita dengar bahwasanya Salafi mengatakan yad itu adalah tangan. Sementara aliran Asy'ariyah Maturidi, yad itu bukan tangan, melainkan ia adalah kekuasaan. Oleh karena itu Imam Ghazali menegaskan hal ini dalam kitabnya Al-Arba'in fi Usuluddin, bahwa seseorang ketika mengkaji persoalan akidah dituntut untuk memiliki penghayatan yang optimal, sehingga ia boleh mendapatkan keyakinan yang penuh tentang kebenaran akidah. Terdapat dua kategori manusia dalam mempelajari akidah. Pertama, ia menggali argumentasi akidah tanpa menyelami rahasia-rahasianya. Kedua, ia menggali rahasia, inti makna dan hakikat yang tersirat di sebaliknya. Jadi ini tadi hubungannya dengan persoalan pembagian al-hakikah wa al-majaz. Jadi beliau kata takwil adalah pemaknaan alternatif dari makna asal zahir berdasarkan argumentasi yang menyertainya, sehingga setiap takwil prosesnya adalah pengalihan makna asal kepada majaz. Jadi rujukan ini sila baca kitab Al-Arba'in fi Usuluddin dan kitab usul fiqh beliau yaitu Al-Mustasfa min Ilmil Usul. Next. Jadi di sini dibagi satu contoh. Tatkala menemukan ayat qala ya iblis summa mana'aka an tasjuda lima khalaqtu bi yadai astakbarta am kunta minal alim. Jadi Allah berfirman, hai iblis, apakah yang menghalangi kamu sujud kepada yang telah kuciptakan yang kedua tanganku? Kita melihat kedua tanganku. Apakah kamu menyombongkan diri atau kamu merasa termasuk orang-orang yang lebih tinggi? Al-alim. Jadi dalam konteks teologi Asy'ari Maturidi, kalimat khalaqtu biyadayya di sini itu adalah bersifat majazi. Kuciptakan dengan kedua tanganku. Sehingga sebenarnya arti hakikat daripada kedua tangan ini perlu ditakwilkan kepada kekuasaan atau ketentuan Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Rujukannya ada di sebelah kiri, yaitu kitab Nihayatul Iqdam fi Ilmil Kalam dan kitab Al-Mawaqif fi Ilmil Kalam. Next. Sekarang pembagian maqasid. Jadi ini poin terakhir. Jadi kalau tadi kita katakan bahwasanya kajian maqasid akidah ini tidak sistematik, tidak tersusun sebagaimana hanya kajian maqasid akidah. Nah, oleh karena itu kita sebagai pengkaji ya yang boleh katakan masih pemula juga, sebab apa? Kita selama ini alpa. Maknanya kita tidak pernah menggali kedalaman makna maqasid akidah. Apa? Sebabkan kita ini hanya fokus kepada pertikaian yang tidak begitu penting sebenarnya dalam akidah. Contoh kita berpikir tentang khalqul Quran. Nah, jadi zaman sekarang ini masih saja ya ada di antara pengkaji akidah ini masih terus membicarakan tentang khalqul Quran. Quran makhluk atau tidak. Kemudian kalau kata makhluk apa hukumnya? Kalau kata tidak makhluk apa hukumnya? Sehingga terjadilah sesat menyesatkan dan kafir mengkafirkan. Kenapa? Karena itu saya dalam buku, sebenarnya ini buku yang saya tulis ya. Jadi sudah 2 tahun sebenarnya saya tulis buku ini, jadi masih dalam keadaan manuskrip. Jadi sebuah buku yang saya berjudul sementara Al-Aqid Ta'ammulat fil Aqidati wa Maqasiduha dalam bahasa Arab. Jadi insya Allah saya akan terbitkan di tempat yang sama, yaitu Darul Kutub Ilmiah Beirut. Jadi yang samping itu saya sudah kaji tentang khilafah, kontroversi ulama kalam dalam semua persoalan-persoalan akidah. Jadi saya merasa buku ini tidak mencukupi untuk menyelesaikan umat. Sebab apa? Kita hanya mengumpulkan persoalan-persoalan itu dan kita pertikaikan. Jadi sekarang saya punya konsep baru, bagaimana saya menulis lagi buku untuk meningkatkan atau untuk mengembangkan kajian ilmu kalam ini yang tidak hanya terfokus kepada khilafiyah saja. Makanya saya tulislah buku Ta'ammulat fil Aqidati wa Maqasiduha. Jadi kalau kita melihat persoalan akidah, bahwasanya itu dibagi kepada ilahiyat, nubuat, sam'iyat. Dan ada juga tambahan imamah. Dan imamah ini sebenarnya bukan persoalan akidah, melainkan dia adalah persoalan furu dalam Islamic study sebenarnya ya. Jadi asyiyah syar'iyyah. Jadi politik ini adalah persoalan yang mengarah ke persoalan fikih, bukan kepada akidah. Tapi walau bagaimanapun, ulama kalam ini tidak mau ketinggalan ikut merespon golongan Syiah yang menjadikan persoalan imamah ini adalah sebagai rukun iman dalam akidah mereka. Ya, next. Jadi kesimpulannya, pembahasan maqasid ini dengan mudahnya kita boleh bahaskan sesuai dengan pembahasan ilmu kalam itu sendiri. Jadi saya sudah berusaha juga untuk memberikan satu kaidah awal. Jadi ini kaidah awal berarti bukan paten. Ini adalah hanya sekedar hasil ijtihad saya ketika ingin mengembangkan kajian teologi. Oke, jadi kalau dari segi aspek ilahiyat, tentunya maqasidnya itu adalah dalam isbat al-wahdaniyah. Sebab apa? Pembahasan ilahiyat ini adalah merupakan pembahasan ketuhanan dan merupakan persoalan tentang segala sesuatu yang berhubungan dengan pencipta, yaitu Allah, seperti wujud Allah, nama-nama Allah, dan sifat-sifat Allah. Dalam Islam, Allah diyakini dalam hati, tasdik bil qalbi, dan diucapkan dengan lisan, iqrar bil lisan, sebagai zat agung dan tunggal. Jadi, menurut saya, nilai maqasid akidah dalam pembahasan ilahi ini adalah menitik beratkan kepada isbat al-wahdaniyah. Jadi tujuannya pembahasan ini dilakukan oleh ulama kalam adalah untuk mengkonseptualisasikan bahwa Allah Subhanahu wa taala sebagai zat yang tunggal dan maha kuasa. Next. Oleh karena itu, Imam Ghazali sendiri dalam kitabnya Al-Maqsadul Asna, beliau kata secara rincian tentang konsep maqasid al-ilahiyat. Mendalami konsep ilahiyat bermakna seorang hamba dihendaki hatinya larut sepenuhnya bersama Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Tidak melihat, memandang dan mengharapkan apa-apa dari selain Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Tidak takut hanya kepada Allah. Mengapa tidak? Orang yang larut hatinya bersama Allah meyakini bahwa Allah senantiasa hadir memberikan pertolongannya. Kewujudannya kekal selamanya dan makhluknya akan lenyap, hilang dan hancur. Bahkan orang tersebut sadar diri bahwa ia pun akan lenyap. Jadi disinilah inti maqasid al-ilahiyat. Jadi dalam pembahasan ilahiyat ini intinya adalah bagaimana kita mendalami, meyakini bahwa Allah senantiasa hadir memberikan pertolongan. Jadi ini disebutkan dalam kitab Al-Maqsad Al-Asna yang dikarang oleh Imam Ghazali. Next. Isbatun nubuat. Jadi pembahasan teologi itu adalah mencakupi tentang an-nubuat. Jadi menurut saya maqasid nubuah di sini adalah ada dalam isbat alamiyat ar-risalah. Jadi maqasid nubuat ini saya melihat bahwasanya itu ada dalam isbat alamiyat ar-risalah. Maknanya Rasul kita ini Nabi Muhammad adalah universal. Jadi diutus untuk semua umat. Jadi Nabi Muhammad ini diutus untuk segala siapa-siapa yang ada dalam bumi ini. Qul ya ayyuhan nas inni rasulullah ilaikum jami'an. Itu Allah pun sudah tegaskan. Katakanlah hai manusia, sesungguhnya aku adalah utusan Allah kepada semua. Oke. Lepas itu bagi melestarikan alam semesta, Allah mengutus Nabi Muhammad sebagai rahmatan lil alamin. Wa ma arsalnaka illa rahmatan lil alamin. Next. Sebenarnya pembahasannya ini panjang sebab saya menulis ini 30 halaman. Jadi nanti rakan-rakan semua boleh melihat segala contoh-contoh yang ada sebab maqasid ini sangat luas sebenarnya, tetapi karena waktu yang diberikan sangat terbatas jadi saya tidak mungkin menjelaskan secara rinci. Sekarang yang terakhir, maqasid as-sam'iyat. Jadi kalau saya melihat maqasid as-sam'iyat ini adalah isbat al-jaza. Jadi mana kita ini mengkaji sam'iyat merupakan persoalan-persoalan akidah yang menyangkut alam akhirat. Jadi merupakan alam gaib. Dikatakan sam'iyat karena hanya dapat diketahui kebenarannya melalui pendengaran dan pemberian dari teks agama, Quran dan Sunnah. Sebab perkara-perkara dalamnya tadi dari alam kubur, kebangkitan manusia, perhimpunan di padang mahsyar, hisab, mizan, telaga, jembatan dan sebagainya. Jadi perkara-perkara ini tersebut lengkap, disebut dan terjelas dalam Al-Quran, Al-Karim dan hadis. Oleh karena itu saya menilai, jadi dalam pembahasan as-sam'iyat, maka maqasid di sini yang perlu kita fahami bahwasanya adalah isbat al-jaza. Isbat al-jaza adalah kita mesti yakin sepenuhnya bahwasanya di akhirat ini adalah hari pembalasan. Oleh karena itu dalam firman Allah banyak sekali. Contohnya walladzina amanu wa 'amilus solihati ulaika ashabul jannati hum fiha khalidun. Jadi contoh-contoh lainnya banyak dalam artikel. Jadi mungkin nanti dirujuk ke sana. Jadi kesimpulannya maqasid ilahiyah itu adalah isbat al-wahdaniyah, maqasid an-nubuwah itu adalah isbat alamiyat ar-rasul al-nabi, dan yang last sekali adalah isbat as-sam'iyat yaitu isbat al-jaza. Oke, next. Oke, jadi saya tadi sudah sentuh bahwasanya sebenarnya nih saya belum puas untuk menulis buku yang diterbitkan tahun 2014 di Darul Kutub Ilmiah Beirut. Oleh karena itu inilah yang mendorong saya untuk kembali mengkaji ulang, melihat ulang persoalan-persoalan yang kita perlukan dalam masa kontemporer ini. Yang tujuannya adalah supaya kita ini tidak begitu bergaduh antara sesama umat ini. Sebab apa? Selama ini kita masih hanya bergaduh membicarakan secara rinci tentang ayat-ayat sifat bolehkah takwil atau tidak. Sementara kita lupa bahwasanya di sebalik itu ada sesuatu yang perlu kita fahami dan perlu kita sampaikan kepada audiens atau masyarakat, sehingga supaya kita ini sudah berhenti bergaduh antara sesama. Oke, next, sebagai kesimpulan, ya di akhir pemaparan Jadi ada beberapa kesimpulan yang saya boleh highlightkan di sini. Yang pertama, kajian maqasid akidah selama ini tidak mendapatkan perhatian oleh ulama. Dan akibatnya hingga saat ini belum ditemui kajian yang menyeluruh. Sebab tulisan-tulisan yang dikembangkan oleh beberapa pengkaji umumnya masih bersifat ad hoc dan terpilah-pilah tanpa dirumuskan secara metodologi yang sistematis. Jadi kalau kita googling ya sekarang ya, tulis maqasid akidah, maka kita akan menemukan beberapa artikel yang tidak menyeluruh, dan begitu terkadang pun juga dia hanya membahas secara kulitnya saja. Sehinggalah kalau demikian rupanya tidak ada penulisan buku yang komprehensif, maka sampai kapan kita ini tidak memberikan satu sumbangsi tentang kajian maqasid dalam teologi Islam. Kedua, kajian maqasid akidah dapat memberikan pemahaman yang mendalam tentang esensi akidah Islam sehingga ia menjadi pemersatu dalam akidah. Tiga, kajian maqasid akidah sebagai solusi atas persoalan-persoalan kontroversi dalam furu' akidah. Sebab apa? Itu saya katakan tadi, semoga dengan pembahasan maqasid akidah ini, kita ini umat Islam berhenti bergaduh antara sesama. Kenapa? Sebab apa? Kita menuju maqasid. Jadi maksud dan tujuan apa sebenarnya ilahiyat itu, apa maksud tujuan as-sam'iyat, dan apa maksud tujuan daripada an-nubuwat. Yang terakhir, kajian maqasid akidah sebagai solusi atas kontradiksi ayat-ayat mutasyabihat yang berkaitan dengan akidah. Wallahu a'lam bishawab, dan mohon maaf sekali lagi, tadi internet terputus di kampus, jadi sekarang ini saya berbicara di dalam rumah. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, we give applause for the very insightful presentation from Professor Kamaluddin Nurdin Marjuni. All right, so now we are opening question and answer session, and there have been 3 questions. 2 questions for the peer presenters, Prof. Anne and Dr. Lemon. So, Prof. Anne and Dr. Lemon, please directly answer the question because there are 2 questions here. And as we know, the time limit us, so we only have 10 minutes. We only have 10 minutes to answer the whole questions here. Okay, so please. Okay, so the question for the peer presenters, the question is from Muhammad Rusdi in IAIN Bone. The question is, would you like to tell us about the self-management concept of female lecturer in Australia, especially the cases that correlated with their efforts to mainstream gender issues? So, could you please tell us about the self-management concept of female lecturers in Australia, especially for the cases related to their efforts to mainstream gender issues? Okay, so who will answer the question? Prof. Anne or Dr. Lemon? Okay, hello. Prof. Anne, are you still with us? Dr. Lemon, still join with us? Dr. Lemon? Yeah. Hello. Can you hear my voice, Dr. Lemon and Prof. Anne? All right. Well, while waiting for the peer presenters rejoin with us again, the second question here, the second question addressed to the same presenters, and they are not with us. And the third question for Mr. Kamal, the question still from Muhammad Rusdi in IAIN Bone. The question is, how can we contact Mr. Kamal. Yeah, Mr. Kamal doesn't need to answer. I'll help you answer this question by calling him or by email. Yeah, is it right, Mr. Kamal?
Inshallah.
Oh, inshallah. Alvin Maulana, what happened to him? Huh? Forest hand. Oh, sorry. I didn't see. Where is your hand, Alvin? Wait. Oh yeah, this one. Yeah, please make your mic active, Alvin. You might speak now.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much. But I'm so sorry because I will question with Indonesian English, in Indonesian language. I'm sorry. Saya mau bertanya kepada Prof. Kamaluddin terkait dengan tadi sudah dijelaskan apa makosid syariah. Ya.
Ya, makosid akidah.
Makosid akidah.
Ya.
Mungkin bisa dikaitkan nanti gini ya, Prof.
Ya.
Saya memang sekarang lagi apa ya, penelitian saya lebih banyak ke zakat produktif. Saya memang bergerak di ekonomi syariah.
Ya.
Nah, menurut Prof. ya, menurut Prof. Kamaluddin, bagaimana terkait dengan makosid terkait dengan zakat produktif? Ya. Mungkin kalau di Malaysia mungkin di Malaysia tidak begitu banyak mengembangkan zakat produktif karena saya beberapa kali baca literatur jurnal itu yang namanya zakat ya konsumtif gitu. Nah, tapi kalau di kami di Indonesia itu banyak mengembangkan terkait dengan zakat produktif. Nah, mungkin bisa dilihat dari sisi makosidnya seperti apa, Prof? Zakat produktif.
Okay, directly answer the question.
Baik, ya terima kasih kepada saudara penanya. Jadi saya sebenarnya ini bukan bidang syariah.
Oke.
Ya, jadi saya jauh daripada bidang syariah. Jadi saya sebenarnya bidang akidah. Nah, jadi saya ini memaparkan satu persoalan yang boleh dianggap barulah dalam teologi Islam. Sehinggalah saya sedang menulis tentang maqasid akidah. Jadi mohon maaf kalau saya tidak boleh menjawab persoalan yang ditanyakan sebab itu tidak menyangkut dengan bidang saya atau bidang syariah. Jadi apapun sebenarnya di Malaysia pun juga maqasid syariah itu sudah menjadi satu pembahasan yang betul-betul diperhatikan. Jadi bahkan secara negara, kerajaan istilah sini itu memang sudah diterapkan tentang maqasid syariah dan khususnya itu dalam bidang zakat. Jadi kalau dikatakan tadi bahwasanya di Malaysia kurang ini, itu terbalik ya sebenarnya. Di sini bahkan sudah menjadi satu agenda utama kerajaan pemerintahan Malaysia untuk bagaimana memberikan maqasid syariah di segala bidang. Jadi dalam bidang kepimpinan, pemerintahan, batu bidang zakat terutamanya, dan sini masya Allah ya pada zakat ini betul-betul terkoordinir di sini. Jadi di sini masing-masing wilayah atau negeri yang ada di Malaysia itu memang sudah menerapkan sistem maqasid syariah dalam perihal zakat. Jadi boleh nanti kontak saya secara pribadi. Nah, saya akan perkenalkan rakan-rakan saya di USIM yang terlibat dalam persoalan maqasid syariah di bab zakat ini. Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you so much for the very clear and very detailed answers. All right, any other question? No more questions, yeah? Yeah. No Lemon, no question.
Ya, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Walaupun beliau tidak hadir karena mungkin salah faham, beliau kira bahwa sudah selesai dan beliau keluar dari Zoom. Beliau di bukunya yang dia presentasi tentang pendidikan anak dari generasi masih muda sampai terakhir sebagai ibu dan grandma. Kami sebagai Muslim, kami tahu dan juga masyarakat Indonesia sini, pendidikan mulai dari keluarga. dari Roma. Dan sebagai Muslim dan banyak keluarga Muslim sekarang ikuti yang pelajaran ini bahwa aturan ini bahwa anak perempuan yang hamil sudah hamil mulai dari bulan 4 suaminya harus setiap hari kasih waktu baca 1 juz baca Quran supaya karena anak mulai mendengar berarti bandingkan mulai dari masih sama bundanya sama ibunya. Jadi sekarang di zaman sekarang setelah melahirkan sudah ada anak-anak dalam keluarga. Bagaimana challenge yang kami hadapi sekarang? Masalah kami hadapi sekarang pelajaran dari internet dari global tidak ada waktu cukup untuk anak-anak sama keluarganya. Bagaimana mereka bisa handle masalah ini? Ya, saya kira waktu tidak cukup untuk membahas Khurud. Ya, terima kasih banyak. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Oke, sebagai kesimpulan singkat bahwa maqasid adalah sebuah aturan atau syariah di mana target daripada maqasid ini adalah untuk menyelamatkan umat muslim, menyelamatkan umat Islam mencapai tujuannya, mencapai tujuan akhir di dalam kehidupannya. Ya, jadi maqasid itu artinya adalah target atau goal. Kemudian untuk the peer presenter sebagai sesuatu yang sangat baru buat kita ya di bidang pendidikan. Selama ini kita hanya melakukan riset pada teaching and learning models, ya, kemudian curriculum development. Tetapi Anne dan Lemon memperkenalkan sebuah auto etnografi di mana data-data itu bisa diambil dari surat, dari fotographs, ya, termasuk puisi katanya. Termasuk puisi itu bisa diambil data sebagai apa istilahnya kalimat-kalimat di dalam di situ keluhan-keluhan termasuk harapan-harapan orang-orang di sekitar kita ya itu bisa menjadi data dalam autoetnografi ini dalam bidang pendidikan. Baiklah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending this international conference on social and Islamic studies, and I don't forget to say my big thanks to the three presenters, Bapak Profesor Kamaluddin Nurdin Marjuni, and the both peer presenters, Professor Anne and Dr. Lemon. And this is the end of our agenda today. Thank you so much once again. Nasrun minallah wa fathun qarib. Wabashiril mu'minin. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.
Much better if we continue with the second main presenter today, Dr. Anne Carey, assisted by Dr. Narel Lemon. Okay, welcome, Dr. Anne. Dr. Anne, can you hear my voice? Yeah, already with us. Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining with us because Mr. Kamaluddin has got trouble with his devices. That's why we postpone, and then Mr. Anne take over the time. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, Mr. Anne, what time is it now in Australia?
It is nearly 12:30 in the early afternoon.
Oh, yeah. So it's gonna take lunch, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Miss Anne. Yeah, Mrs. Anne, did you join with us with Mr. Kamal just now?
Oh, no, sorry, I wasn't able to join.
Oh yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Actually, normally he is the first presenter, but he has got some trouble with his devices, and then his connection is unstable. That's why I skip to utilize the time. All right, so Miss Dr. Anne, you are assisted by Miss Lemon, yeah, Dr.
Yes,
Lemon.
Associate Professor Narelle Lemon.
Oh, sorry, Associate Professor Narelle Lemon, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Narelle Lemon. Good morning, good afternoon over there, yeah. Good afternoon.
Good morning, good afternoon. That's
Oh, still-
right. Hello.
Oh yeah, good morning and good afternoon. It's okay. Okay, Dr. Narelle Lemon, do you live in with the same city with Mrs. Anna?
Yes, we're both in
Different, yeah.
Melbourne.
Oh, in Melbourne.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so Dr. Anne, sorry, Professor Anne and Associate Professor Narelle Lemon will talk about autoethnography, autobiographical experiences of being the researcher and the research. Okay. Well, before I let the both presenters to elaborate and explain their presentation, I'd like briefly to read the curriculum vitae of Professor Anne Carey. So Professor Anne Carey is a senior lecturer with the Faculty of Education. She explores social and educational responses to risk and resilience to gain a better understanding of the impact of conflict on changes in families and family relationship, and how these changes shape transition to education, work, and community life. So in Indonesia, Professor Anne is the expert in family education, ya, pendidikan keluarga. And Professor Anne has a lot of publication, yeah, and I couldn't mention one by one here, but what we call it? Yeah, and her recent publication, the book with the title Education, Work, and Catholic Life, Stories of Three Generations of Australian Mothers and Daughters, and then published in Singapore, Springer, 2020. Yeah, like what I said before, that Professor Anne is the expert of family education. In Indonesia, we call it pendidikan keluarga. Yeah, as we know, the first education that we get is family education. All right, so I believe it is very interesting paper, very interesting discussion. But before I let the both presenters to continue presenting, I'd like to briefly read the curriculum vitae of Associate Professor Dr. Narelle Lemon. Narelle Lemon is an Associate Professor in Education and the Associate Dean in Education in the School of Social Sciences, Media, Film, and Education at Swinburne University of Technology, Melbourne, Australia. Narelle is trained in the disciplines of arts, education, and positive psychology. Her overarching research area is focused on participation and engagement. She explores this through a variety of avenues, including social media use for learning and professional development, creativity and arts education, and positive psychology, specifically aimed at mindful practice and proactive self-care strategies. Yeah, this is, I underline here, proactive self-care strategies. We need Associate Professor Dr. Narel Lemon to explain what you mean with proactive self-care strategies. All right. And then you might follow her Twitter and Instagram at Really Pops, And the great achievement of Mrs. Narel is about 2 of her books will be published in 2022, next year. Yeah, there are 2 books that she will publish. The first entitled "Creating a Place for Self-Care." This one, self-care, like what I have read above. Creating a place for self-care and well-being in academia, finding meaning across academia, will be published in London. And the second title, Healthy Relationship in Higher Education, promoting well-being across academia, and will be published in London as well. All right, to utilize the time, I'd like to invite both presenters, but of course, Professor Anne Carey will be taking her first part of the presentation. Well, the Excellency, Professor Anne Carey, time is yours in around 20 minutes, 30 minutes. For both, 30 minutes for both or only for Anne? Oh yeah, you may extend and unlimited times, yeah? All right, Professor Anne, please, time is yours.
Thank you very much for welcoming us here today. It's a great honor to be presenting, and I wish we could be with you in Sulawesi. I had a wonderful trip to Sulawesi a few years ago, and everybody was so welcoming and friendly. So we're really honored to be presenting today. So we might have the next slide. Thank you. So today we're going to talk about autoethnography. So autoethnography is both a method and it's a way of writing up interdisciplinary research where we look at our own personal experiences and how it relates to culture. So in this presentation, we're going to be looking at our autobiographical experiences of being the researcher as well as being the researched. We'll look at opportunities autoethnography opens up in the field of education and the types of roles that we as educators and researchers take on in this type of research. We'll talk about how we build the field for our own research experiences and describe some of the diverse methods we use for data collection. So we might look at the next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to share from my work about education work and Catholic life, stories of 3 generations of Australian mothers and daughters, and there's the website link there. I undertook this work as part of my PhD in 1995 to 1997, and I interviewed 13 families, and they were women I went to school with and our mothers. And I looked at what the experience of growing up Catholic was for mothers and daughters and how it influenced their relationship. Then when I began at Monash in 2015, I thought I'd like to go back and re-interview those women. So in 2016 to 18, I went back and I undertook a qualitative longitudinal study by revisiting the women I'd interviewed 20 years earlier. Some of the women had passed away, such as my mother, but then there was the next generation of daughters. So there was 3 generations involved in the 2018 data collection phase. And when I came to write up this research, I thought I would draw on some of my colleagues and a very close friend, Associate Professor Ronnie Egan, who is at RMIT, Professor Lucas Walsh, Dr. Julie Faulkner, and Dr. Kirsten Hutchinson, to help me unravel what the data was telling me. So we wrote it up into a book which was published last year. So could I have the next slide, please? So as part of this research, I was researched as my own mother and sisters and myself were involved in the research. And we conducted focus groups where I was involved in the conversation. So we talked about photographs. We talked about personal memorabilia that had been passed between mothers and daughters. And we also looked at our own past histories, our growing up years, as well as our current lives and what we wanted for the future. Thank you. Next slide. So I'll pass it over to Narelle to talk about a little bit of her work.
Thanks, Anne. So one of the areas of my research is to look at wellbeing for educators. And I do this in a way that looks across educators in school settings, early childhood, primary, secondary, but also those of us that work in higher education and community. And one of the beautiful projects that I have at the moment is with the publisher Routledge based in London. And we have a 12-book contract that looks at highlighting the voice of educators in higher education, but particularly around the aspects of being proactive with our well-being and our self-care. And 2 of those books have just been released, which is just lovely. And what these books have been able to accumulate is, 52 international voices, all writing from the place of ethnographic stance. So they're sharing narratives of your own voice, your own experience, highlighting strategies that are used and work for caring for yourself, that when we share them, have a beautiful gift to be able to support others to consider ways that might support you as individuals as well. So the lovely way of working this way is that our voice is really highlighted, but it's also a collaboration for those who come together in a project such as this, but it's a collaboration for those who read as well. And the conversations continue to happen and to continue to support one another. And as we do this, there's beautiful revealing of insights. Next slide, please. So another project that I've worked on, which is highlighting voice of women, supports being able to work through a narrative and being able to really highlight, where we come from, where we're going to go. And this project worked with a particular scaffold that enabled each author, each researcher to be able to share their voice as well. So I'll just move to the next slide, please. So we used Schwab's flights, which takes us through different ways to explore our own experience and to write our narrative. So we looked at your current lived experience, and then we looked at ways of how we can move forward or move to the future, how we reflect on the past, so looking to the behind us and what has occurred, and then looking to places like upwards, downwards, and to the sidelines. So thinking through our narratives and our experiences in different ways. So when we work with ethnographic ways of writing our narratives, we can really use a whole heap of different structures and different approaches that support us to unpack our stories in different ways that allow for reflection and metacognitive thinking to occur. So next slide, please. So the next question we're going to sort of bounce off with each other is thinking about what kinds of roles does a researcher play in ethnographic research? So next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Narelle. So yes, autoethnographic research that we undertake takes a collaborative approach. So as my role as a researcher in the Mother-Daughter Project, it was multifaceted and I took on many, many roles. I was a daughter as a research participant. I was an aunt and traveller as my niece visited me when I was visiting Italy overseas, and we travelled together looking for cultural artefacts which represented the mother-daughter. I was a visual analyst as I collected photographs across generations of growing up Catholic. And in this photograph, there's my mother, my sister, and her daughter, my niece, at same period of early secondary schooling. And we looked at their school uniforms and how the school uniform had remained much the same since the 1930s to the 2000s. I was also a granddaughter and autobiographer, as I found my grandmother's photo album from the early 20th century. And I once again analysed the photos for what did it mean to be a young Catholic woman in the early 1900s. I was also a niece. Ronnie, my friend who I'd grown up with since the age of 4, and I decided to conduct interviews in a range of places. And we wanted to visit our home because the home was very important to us. So we visited my aunt's home, as both our parents had passed away and our family homes had been sold. And we had a cup of tea with her and we chatted with her, and my aunt became part of the conversation. She became a researcher as well as the researched. I was also a teacher, as I'm a teacher educator now, and I look back on my early years as a kindergarten teacher, which I began in New Zealand in the 1980s. I was a friend and writer with my friend Ronnie, as well as my other colleagues from Monash and Deakin University. And I was a cultural historian. I unpacked the cultural aspects of what it was to grow up Catholic. Next slide, please.
So when we think about the roles that we undertake as a researcher and being researched in autoethnographic research approaches, I start to think about being a detective, and particularly about revealing the right voice at the right time. And so when you're being researched and you are sharing your voice, there's an aspect about thinking about what is right to share right now based on your journey that you're going and the narrative that you wish to share out publicly. And so there's lots of considerations in terms of those aspects about thinking about how you approach that, how you frame it, and how you are gentle to yourself, but also careful and aware of how it may be read and interpreted as well. So next slide, please. So in the project that we looked at in mindfulness in the academy, we wrote a lot about our different experiences of working in higher education institutions. And there was an aspect there, I wrote a chapter about not playing the Hunger Games, which was talking about some of those negative aspects of our culture that can be present in our industry. Now, it'd be really easy to finger point and be negative, but that's not going to be helpful as you share your narrative and for others reading as well. So there's that aspect of being positive, but being in a way that is proactive, that is supportive, to think about other perspectives. So as a detective, you're undertaking that role with yourself to really unpack, how do you tell a story? How do you tell the hidden, the transparent, the evaded in a way that supports yourself in your journey as the researcher, but in a way where you're being researched as well and others are looking at your practice. So this book really focused a lot on those sorts of aspects coming through. And if we just flip through the next slide and the next slide after that, so if we go through forward to, thank you. Yep, and you can go to the next one. Thank you. One of the beautiful things that we can do when we are sharing our narrative and working in ethnographic ways is that you can share the voice of your experiences and how you've heard things as well. And one of these ways that I've represented it is in kind of like a mini poem, but in terms of laying out different sayings that were there that impacted being confronted with the environment that we're in. And it's a way of getting it out that others could resonate. And so this beautiful way of working enables us to be able to share and write in different ways. And so this is just one example where we've taken comments or reflections in a way that's just shared them in little stanzas and in a very different way on the page as well. And it's not just a line down, we're just thinking about in different ways to enable a different interaction. And so when we work in an ethnographic way and thinking about sharing your own stories, we're allowed to explore how we present that in different ways. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we progress through this presentation. So we'll move to the next slide, please.
Oh, and the next slide, please. Oh,
yeah. And the next one. Beautiful.
So before we move on to this question, how is autoethnographic data collected? I'd like to reflect on some of the points that Narelle made about being an investigator and being a researcher who was researching my own life and my friends' lives. I felt like I was walking on glass at times. It was like a tightrope because I wasn't just representing the ideas and the emotions and the life experiences of people I didn't know very well, but these were people who were really close to me. And it was very, I had to represent their lives in a very sensitive way. And it made me reflect on my other research situations as well. It was very different to be researched and be researching people so close to you. And as part of the process, we wrote up our first draft of the data, and then we asked the women to come to an evening where we told them about the different findings that we'd found. And that sort of gave us a sense of how the women felt about the way we were writing up their lives and representing who they were. And we realised that how generous the women had been to share their stories with us and to trust us as researchers. But there was one instance where we had a writing day, the 5 writers, researchers of the book, and one of the researched got a bit upset about the way she had been represented by one of the other researchers. And it was a very tense and emotional moment, and we had to negotiate that and go back to the data and think about, well, how could it be represented in a different way? So autoethnographic research not only makes you think about your own autobiographical stance and who you are, but I think it helps you to think about how you can make your own research with others who maybe you don't know as well, be more sensitive in the way that you represent the research participant. So how is autoethnographic data collected? Next slide, please. So for the mother-daughter research, it was collected in a range of ways. So one of the ways we collected data was to ask the women to bring something to the group interview between mothers and daughters that represented their lives as mothers and daughters. And on the left-hand corner, Park Royal, on the Park Royal letterhead, one of the women brought along a letter that her mother had written to her in the 1970s. And this was in 2018. She shared this letter with us, and her mother had written it to her in handwriting when she was living in India. And she talked about how was her daughter's children and how she was missing them, and she longed for them, and she looked forward to seeing them again. So it was a very moving letter, and it was something that this woman had kept for more than 30 years. Another cultural artifact that had been passed between mothers and daughters was this collection of cups and saucers in the cabinet, which had a beautiful story about how they had been given to her on her wedding day, and it had been given to her mother on her wedding day and had been passed down to the daughter. There were paintings. Then there were also religious artifacts that had been passed between mothers and daughters. Diary entries. I had my own diary entries from when I was a young woman travelling overseas throughout Europe and Asia. And we drew on those diaries as well to unpack what it was to be a young woman travelling and communicating not only with myself, but with those back home. I found my mother's old school book from the 1930s, which was a real treasure to find and to be able to do some document analysis about the different stories, religious stories that were told in this school book, and the beautiful handwriting that my mother had. As I said, I had my grandmother's photo album from the 1920s, and you can see my grandmother with her best friend Vera holding box brownie cameras. And then there were the audio recorded interviews that we conducted with the women. And those interviews were transcribed, and then they were given back to the women for checking. So it was a multi-methodological approach, multimodal approach to collecting data. And we wrote up the different data sets in different ways and drew on different theories and methodological insights to interpret this visual as well as written text, and also the audio recordings. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the next question is, can you say that autoethnography includes field work? And if you can, how to build a field in that case? So this is an interesting question. Next slide, please. So not only did I go and interview the mothers and daughters and the granddaughters, but also I decided that my friend Ronnie, who was now an associate professor in social work at RMIT, our families had many things in common as well as some differences. We'd both grown up in the leafy suburbs of Melbourne and had gone to the same Catholic primary school and Catholic secondary school. We'd been friends for many years. So I thought it'd be interesting to bring Ronnie in this autoethnographic experience as well. So we sat down and we talked about how could we collect data on our two families. And we decided that we would have 5 conversations in 5 different places. So this was about building the field. So the first place we went to was the church of our primary school, where we'd made our Holy Communion and other religious rituals we'd undertaken as young children. And we had a conversation about what our primary school years had meant to us. Oops, we've just lost the slideshow. Then we went to our secondary school and we went to the parlour room where Ronnie had learnt the piano one of the nuns who had taught us at school had taught her the piano. And we had a conversation, and this whole sense of place came into being as we sat in the school where we had attended secondary school, and we felt this religious aura around us as we talked about our school days. Then Ronnie and we were busy academics, and it was hard to fit in all these conversations. Ronnie was going to a conference in New Zealand, and I thought I'll go and visit her in New Zealand because New Zealand had a lot of meaning to me, because that was my first job as a kindergarten teacher. I spent 2 years in New Zealand teaching young children in a kindergarten. So we had a conversation about our busy academic lives and our roles, our gendered roles as women in higher education. Then, as I said, we decided we'd visit my auntie in her home, because our homes where we had grown up were very meaningful to us. And finally, when Ronnie's mother passed away, her family had put a seat on the beach where her mother used to walk every afternoon. So we decided to have our final conversation at the beach, and you can see us leaning over the seat, which was in memorial of her mother. And we talked about what our mothers would have thought about us doing this research and writing it up into a book. So we thought, how will we theorize this, and how will we come to a better understanding of these different conversations that we were having? So we went to a French psychoanalyst, Luce Irigaray, and her book that she had published in 2008 about conversations. And these conversations of everyday life, how meaningful they can be and help us interpret our lives and explain the different experiences and histories of our lives and our relationships. Thank you. Next slide, please. So then we move on to, what does reflexivity mean in autoethnographic research? Next slide, please. So moving on past the mother-daughter research, currently I'm undertaking some intergenerational research into mothers and their young children under 5 years of age. And I guess the extent to which we as readers actually notice the presence of researchers in research accounts or data depends on the methods that we use and the way that we report our findings. An audience is something that we think about all the time when we're writing up our findings. Are we writing for our friends, in my case? Are we writing for a scholarly audience? Are we writing for other women sometimes, or for other colleagues? So in the way that we think about writing up data, we make a deliberate commitment to reflexivity and thinking about, well, what's our role and our perspectives when we represent the different accounts that we collect through our interviews, through our multi-methodological data collection modes. What role, what powerful roles do we have as researcher? And what is the power of the research participants? There's a negotiation that goes on there. And I think that's part of the interesting things when you're interviewing friends is sometimes they talk about things and you have a different memory of it. And sometimes I knew that they weren't telling me things about their lives that I knew would be very interesting, but I had to be very sensitive and acknowledge that they didn't want to share that aspect of their life at that point in time. So being knowing about people's lives and knowing what they're sharing in their interviews can be a fine line to walk as you negotiate the interview. So when I return to view family photographs, I review them from a deliberately reflexive perspective. The stories sometimes can be fragile and sometimes sensitive, and the visual analysis foregrounds the resilience of qualitative longitudinal research. And Miller describes this as the precariousness of interviewing as the tenuousness of selves and selfhoods, the way in which the powerful ways we talk about things shape what is felt to be okay to be said and what remains unspoken. So sometimes it's okay not to tell everything in an interview, and we need to respect that. So when recounting the stories behind family photographs, confirming, reevaluating and refining earlier versions of stories can sometimes be part of what we relate in the photographs. So sometimes when I was looking at the photographs, different histories would come into view, depending maybe on the different theoretical lens that I was using, or the different interpretive lens that I was using to say what story was happening in the different photographs or in the interview conversations. I'll pass it over to Narelle now. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Anne. So reinforcing aspects that Anne has talked about, when we're being reflexive, we're really thinking about that researcher practitioner way of finding our voice, revealing who we are. And when we do that, we're able to really engage with practice and theory and have those intersections that go with and across each other, but we're allowed to be intimate as well. And as intimacy and that vulnerability really helps us to be able to investigate and unpack the lived experiences, and particularly in relation to context and time in our life. So just as we can collect different data that enables us to be able to share stories, we can represent our stories in different ways as well. So at the start of this year, I had a co-authored paper that was shared out about well-being and wholeheartedness in education. And we particularly drew on notions of what that means from the perspective of the researcher Brené Brown. And she does a lot of work in vulnerability. And the way we represented the voices of teachers that we had interviewed and researched through qualitative surveys was to present their voice, teachers' voice, using poetic representation. But in order to be reflective and reflexive as well, we located our voice as researchers as well at the beginning of the paper. So I just want to share what that looks like, but also how when we read it and how someone reads it as well can also support the sharing of our stories and the revealing of our vulnerabilities as well. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So as we think about sharing and showing our voice in different ways, poetry is one example of how we can do it. So this is a poem that I wrote that was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was thinking through, for me as an educator, what was happening. So stripped back, bare, exposed, rawness, real, authentic, alive, confronting, a global pause, reflection, deep listening. What is it for? A global pause, time to reflect, working on self, cultivating our best selves. Interruption, refresh, renew, restart, repurpose, reposition, renounce, stepping back, vulnerable, heart and mind, awareness, intention, pause. So as we work with this methodology, we can collect different data, but we can also represent our data in different ways. And so that's an example of representing narrative, our story, autobiographical data in a different way through poetry. And then of course, when you get to read it yourself, it sort of comes off the page as well and adds that an extra layer. Next slide, please. So our final question, we start to think about the researchers' personal experiences and how they're reflected in autobiographic research. And how does the researcher convince the reader of the ethics and reliability of the research? And this is really juicy question to think about our ethics and how that sits in multiple layers. And of course, both Anne and I do a lot of work, not only on ourselves and adults, but we also work with young people under the age of 18 as well. So there's always an ethics there in terms of voice, how we share it, and seeking permission as well. And it's not only seeking permission from parents and caregivers, but also from the young people themselves, and they know how their voice is going to be shared and what that means. I want to share another aspect in terms of the ethics and think about when we work with autoethnographic data or duo-ethnographic data, when two people are working together and bouncing off one another and sharing their stories, thinking through that the ethics of working together to share those stories in a way. So next slide, please. So in a chapter that's actually going to be in a book that comes out next year, I worked with a new colleague in New Zealand, and she had approached me to write together in a duo-ethnographic way. And we hadn't worked together before. And so ethically, we had a conversation with each other before starting in terms of how we would work together in order to honour each of our lived experiences, how we would share the narrative, but also to really think through how are we ethically caring for each other in this way of working. So I want to show you a framework that we worked by and a series of questions that helps us think through what that might look like. So next slide, please. Oh, we'll go to the next slide and then we'll come back. Oh, next, forward and forward again. So we want to go to slide 28, so the one with the chart. So
the other way. Sorry.
Other way, yeah. One.
Back,
Yes,
it.
that's it. Beautiful. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. So when we start to think about duo-ethnography, ethnographic ways of working and thinking about the ethics behind personal reflections, it's really important to think through who you are as researchers and who you are as going to be researched together. And so these big questions are beautiful in terms of thinking about different ways we work, the power dynamics between each other, the relationship indeed in terms of how you can come together and work together. You know, there's different standards that you are, that how you could bounce off one another in a way that's respectful, acknowledging things like what might make you upset, what might enable you to flourish. How do you cope with that? How do you deal with each other? It's also thinking about outcomes of what do you want to achieve when you work together this way for yourselves collectively, but also for the audience as well. So there's a lot of different questions you can think through in that way. So I'll hand over to Anne, but we'll go back one slide, please. Beautiful.
So I guess the ethical considerations are multifaceted, just as the data collection can be multifaceted and ways of representing your data. And it's not just about getting Monash or university ethics approval to conduct research, but I think autoethnography really foregrounds the ethics of just conducting research, because you're so involved and it's at such a personal level that it really makes you consider as a researcher and what you're doing, as well as asking, why are you doing this? And should I be doing this research? And is it important? And what's the point of doing this research? So I think as a researcher, it brings to the fore many key questions. So in my own research on mothers and daughters, originally I thought I'll just use pseudonyms for the names of the women, but many of the women actually wanted to use their real names. They didn't want to use pseudonyms. which was interesting. And I also drew on the work of, so they didn't want to remain anonymous. They wanted themselves to be represented as who they were through their names and their photographs and through the cultural artifacts that they shared. I guess autoethnography and the way that we reflectively looked upon ourselves and our work is a way of re-seeing the social world. It's not about being objective, but it's more about being subjective in the way we consider research and we theorize experience. And ethics is core to all of this. It's a key consideration. And one of the things that we grappled with when writing up my research about mothers and daughters was that of being an insider and outsider. And because I was being researched myself, I was so close to the data and so close to everything that having an outsider's gaze, working with other colleagues, helped to unpack some of what I took for granted. Sometimes I'd write up the data and they'd say, "What do you mean by this? Why did you wear white veils when you made your first Holy Communion?" And I thought, don't you know all these religious things? But because I was so close to the data, I didn't think that I needed to make visible what was happening in the photographs as much as I needed to. So there was ethical considerations there about my own familiarity with the data and the research context. And the other researchers helped me to not only further my own insights into my lived experience and my role as a researcher, but they helped me to reveal this as well. So there was a shift from the research participants' voices to the authors' interpretations, and this involved us as researchers making decisions about what data to include and exclude and how to include it and in what form and how to interpret it. And when drafting the chapters, we foregrounded the stories of a select group of research participants, or sometimes the other stories remained at the backdrop, whereas other times we told everybody's stories as a group. So it was sometimes individual stories that we foregrounded and told in the findings, whereas other times we would talk about the group as a whole and their lived experiences as growing up Catholic. So we hope that through this presentation, we've given you a little bit of insight into autoethnographic research and ways of going about autoethnographic research. And we hope that maybe we've given you a sense of and a feeling for wanting to engage in this type of research and to look at yourselves as key to research and to becoming a research participant yourself and a researcher of your own lives. Narelle, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, we hope that you've been inspired. We have shared quite a number of different examples, and this was conscious to be able to find different ways that might connect with you, resonate with you, to explore this way of working and to really empower you to also know that there's not one way of doing it either, and that you can explore different methods, different approaches, both in collecting the data, but also presenting it as well, and really unpacking the depths of stories, lived experience, and connecting theory and practice as well. Can we move forward a slide, please? And another slide, yes. So Anne and I have absolutely loved presenting and meeting you all today. And of course, we're very open for continued conversations and connecting with us as well. So the details here of where you can find us via email and online with our projects as well is shared with you. And we would love to hear from you with your ideas and your work as well. So thanks for having us.
Yes. Thank you. And yes, please keep in contact. We realise that for some of you, this might be a very new approach to research. and we'd be very interested in hearing about your insights. And we hope that we have inspired you a little bit to go out and try a little bit of this type of research. And we'd be interested in you sharing your stories with us. And it's been a great honour to participate in your conference today.
Okay, terima kasih. Thank you so much for the very interesting and challenging research by Prof. Anna and Prof. Narel. Okay, give applause for the peer presenters. All right. Yeah, Mrs. Anna and Narel, today, the 22nd of December 2021, we, the people in Indonesia, celebrate Mother's Day today. Yeah, so I, what we call it? I send my regards to you, both of you, by saying Happy Mother's Day for Mrs. Anna and Mrs. Narel. And how about in OC? Do the people over there celebrate Mother's Day as well today?
Not today, but the first Sunday in May, we celebrate Mother's Day.
First May, yeah. For first May.
First Sunday in May.
First Sunday of May. So every first Sunday of May, people in Australia celebrate Mother's Day.
Yes.
Okay, but we in Indonesia, 22nd of December is Mother's Day. All right, yeah, this is a very interesting research, and I believe it is a new kind of research in education, because actually, yeah, including me, yeah, I just know about ethnography, but right now you introduce to us autoethnography in education, and after that there is also we called duo autoethnography. So if I could ask you, the researchers, what we call it? The researcher behaves as the participatory researchers, yeah? If I'm not mistaken, Mrs. Anna?
Yes, that's right. We are part of the research. We're researching around us and our own experiences and our own histories. And sometimes we may do that on our own or with other colleagues or with other people around us.
All right. So yeah, Mrs. Narel, how about the term of autoethnography? Does autoethnography include only the researcher, him or herself, or the relatives around her or around him, including aunt, daughter, niece? Yeah. Do we call them as autoethnography as well?
We would call that ethnography. So auto is thinking about ourselves, and then if we're thinking about others, then we would call that ethnographic. You can mix them together, which becomes the complicated part. If you are researching other people, you might also want to write about yourself and your interpretation or your feelings, the impact of the others as well, and write in your own voice as well. So it gets a little bit complex and layered, and that's where the aspect of reflection and reflexivity comes into it as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah.